Thank you, Jennifer, so much for coming in today. So if you could start by introducing yourself and telling us about your connection to the land.
Yes, sure. So it's Jennifer David and Tissanakasin. I am of mixed ancestry, which includes Anishinaabe and what we call Innu. Some people might use the word Cree. I'm from a region we call Omashkego or Mushkegowuk territory, which is Treaty 9 territory, northeastern Ontario, and I belong to the Chapleau Cree First Nation. And so I always shout out those ancestral lands where I come from.
So if you could start by telling us about NVision and the path.
Sure. So I am a senior consultant at NVision Insight Group, and I've been a consultant for, almost 25 years now. But prior to that, I left Northern Ontario to come to Ottawa, where I got a journalism degree at Carleton University. And then I used to be the director of communications at the Aboriginal People's TV network. And then I got into my own consulting, and then I joined a company which then morphed into what's now NVision Insight Group. And so probably I've been doing Indigenous cultural awareness for, about 15 years. And it started out as an in-person workshop. And then the TRC issued their calls to action for education. And so from there, we built an online Indigenous cultural awareness course. And then when COVID hit, we moved and adapted our in-person workshop into a virtual facilitated workshop. And so now this course we have is called The Path, Your Journey Through Indigenous Canada. And the reason why we call it The Path is something that Senator Murray Sinclair, retired Senator Murray Sinclair, when he was chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when they issued their report and their calls to action, he said to people, "We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the path to the top. We call on you to do the climbing." And that's how I always describe cultural awareness. It's really that first baby step in climbing that mountain, and that I like to consider myself a guide for people on this path as they do that climbing.
In June 2015, as you mentioned, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its 94 calls to action. Can you share how the path's creation and content reflects and supports the calls to action?
Yeah, so the calls to action from the TRC, there are 94 calls to action. And in those 94, there are 6 that are specifically referencing education. And when they talk about that, they say that different sectors of society must be educated on treaty and Aboriginal rights, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, treaties, residential schools, etc. Then they talk about anti-racism and they talk about bias. And so we've developed 2 path courses. The first one we call Path 1, which is cultural awareness, and the second one, Path 2, which is on anti-racism and bias and stereotypes. And we feel both those courses together fully meet the TRC's calls to action for education.
How can planners benefit from taking the path?
So planners have an important role, right, in our society. They help define and shape communities. So planners need to understand Indigenous communities and Indigenous perspectives, because they really haven't ever been included in these planning processes. So that's one important thing. Planners also look into growth and development. So again, where are Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women included in those discussions about growth and development? And so cultural awareness is helping us understand about the history that we were never told. And I always say this is not Indigenous history. This is Canada's history, and it's Canada's colonial history that we've never been taught. And so it's important for us to have that foundation in any work that we do. And planners, you think about urban planners, there's many Indigenous people now in urban centers. And so what does it mean to understand what those urban Indigenous communities, how are they formed? What do they look like? How are they involved in urban planning processes? So I think those are some important pieces to think about. And we're seeing a lot of Indigenous people today fighting for and into land claims, hashtag land back, land use planning processes. So if people don't understand about the land, about Indigenous people's connection to the land, about treaties and land claims, how can they really adequately do land use planning? So we feel there's many areas that planners would learn from if they take cultural awareness.
What can participants expect to learn about the history and lived experiences of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people by taking the path?
So I'll talk about a few things. One, I don't know if people know, but the Indian Act, when it came into being in 1876, purposefully discriminated against women. You could not get Indian status if you were a woman that belonged to an Indian band. You could only get that if you were a man or a child of a man or married to a man. So that was done intentionally because it disrupted and dismantled matriarchal systems where women had a lot of control and women had a lot of opportunity and leadership. And the federal government in its colonial policies wanted to get rid of that. And they instead wanted to introduce a very patriarchal system that would be consistent across Canada. So that caused devastation in Indigenous families. Another area where they'll learn about Indigenous women is we talk about the importance of women in the fur trade. We all learned about the fur trade in high school, but we don't remember and we're not taught about how women were pivotal to the fur trade. First Nations women, Métis women, because of course they knew how to paddle the canoes and they often accompanied these men who were the fur traders, and they knew how to survive in the winter, they knew how to get food, they knew the plants, the animals, the lakes, the land, they knew the medicines, they could make clothing, and yet they're often forgotten as part of the role in the fur trade. So the other thing that's shocking to people is the treatment of women, and we have an epidemic, missing and murdered Indigenous women, but it didn't just spring up out of nowhere. We have to look at the policies that Canada introduced over the centuries. Things like forced sterilization, things like that still exist in some places, birth alerts, where First Nations women going into hospitals, sometimes when they go in, the hospitals will alert social services, and when that woman delivers their baby, the baby's taken away from them, often just because they are First Nations. I mean, how is this possible? But we have to highlight that these realities exist, and that in the path we talk about that we reap what we sow. If Canada is going to sow these policies and laws of genocide and discrimination, assimilation, why are we surprised that what we're going to reap from that are these startling, horrible statistics about Indigenous people, about Indigenous women? And I think it's important for us to understand and not just look at the symptoms today, but how did we get, and what are the connections from the past to the present?